Some sounds cut through a man's soul like nothing else. The cry of someone you once held close, pleading for help. For mountain man Jedediah Thorne, that sound came on a dusty afternoon in Dryhook when he found a woman tied up behind the saloon, hooded with burlap and barely able to whisper, "I can't breathe." Jed had seen plenty of trouble in his years as a tracker and trapper, but when he pulled away that cloth, he went still as stone. The face, looking back, was one he hadn't seen in 20 years. His lost love, who disappeared in a fire that folks said she started. Now she was back, older and marked by hardship, carrying secrets he couldn't imagine. What had she been running from all this time, and who had left her here for him to find? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The trembling in Jedediah Thorne's hands wasn't from the mountain cold that morning. At 53, he'd learned to read the signs his body gave him, and right now, every instinct screamed that his carefully ordered world was about to come apart at the seams. He knelt beside the woman, his worn leather journal slipping from his coat pocket and hitting the dusty ground with a soft thud. That journal had been his companion for decades, filled with meticulous notes about tracking jobs, weather patterns, and the occasional memory he couldn't quite let go of. Sarah's name appeared on more pages than he cared to admit. "Sarah," he whispered, the word catching in his throat like smoke from a dying fire. Sarah Whitmore. Her eyes, still that deep green he remembered, though now shadowed with years of pain, focused on his face with difficulty. The burlap hood lay crumpled beside her like a discarded shroud, its rough weave stained with sweat and fear. Someone had tied it deliberately, meant to keep her identity hidden until the right person found her. Jed. Her voice was paper-thin, barely more than breath. "Is it really you?" 20 years melted away in an instant. 20 years since the night half of Dryhook burned to the ground, taking Sarah Whitmore with it, or so everyone believed. 20 years since Jedediah had watched the flames consume the boarding house where she lived, searching frantically through smoke and ash until the sheriff pulled him back, telling him no one could have survived that inferno. The fire had started just after midnight on a cold October evening in 1863. Jed remembered every detail with the clarity that comes from reliving a moment too many times. He'd been planning to propose to Sarah the next morning, had spent weeks carving a ring from a piece of mountain oak, polishing it smooth as river stone. Instead, he'd spent that dawn sifting through charred timber and broken dreams. "We need to get you to Doc Henley," Jed said now, forcing his voice steady. His tracker's instincts took over, assessing her condition with practiced efficiency. Dehydration, malnutrition, rope burns around her wrists, and something else, a wariness in her eyes that spoke of prolonged captivity. "Can you stand?" Sarah tried to push herself upright, but collapsed back against the saloon wall. "I don't think so. My legs, they kept me chained for so long, chained." The word hit Jed like a physical blow. He'd spent 20 years imagining Sarah's final moments in that fire, but he'd never pictured this. Years of imprisonment, of suffering he couldn't fathom. "Who did this to you?" he asked. But Sarah's eyes had already drifted closed again, exhaustion claiming her. Jed scooped her up as gently as he could manage. She weighed less than his winter pack, all angles and hollows where curves used to be. The Sarah he remembered had been vibrant, full of laughter and strong opinions about everything from territorial politics to the proper way to break a horse. This woman in his arms felt fragile as bird bones. Doc Henley's office sat 3 blocks down Main Street, past the general store and the blacksmith shop that still bore scorch marks from that long-ago fire. Dryhook had rebuilt after the disaster, but slowly, like a man learning to walk again after a bad injury. The town carried its scars in subtle ways, gaps between buildings that were never quite filled, residents who still glanced nervously at their chimneys when the wind picked up. Jed had avoided the place for years after Sarah's supposed death, unable to bear the memories that lurked around every corner. He'd retreated to his cabin high in the Absaroka Mountains, taking work as a tracker and guide for anyone who needed to find their way through the wilderness. His reputation was solid, Reliable, quiet, and skilled enough to find a lost child or a strayed cattle herd in country that could swallow a man whole. But solitude had its own dangers. Up in those mountains, with only the wind and his thoughts for company, Jed had too much time to remember. Too much time to wonder what might have been if he'd arrived at the boarding house just 10 minutes earlier that night. "Doc!" Jed called as he shouldered through the physician's door, the bell above it jangling with urgent discord. "Doc Henley, I need help!" Dr. Theodore Henley emerged from his back room, wiping his hands on a clean towel. At 68, he moved with the careful precision of a man who'd spent 4 decades setting bones and stitching wounds in a place where the nearest hospital was 3 days' hard ride away. His grey beard was neatly trimmed, his wire-rimmed spectacles perpetually perched on his nose, and his reputation for discretion was as valuable as his medical skill. "Jedediah Thorne," Doc said, taking in the scene with a quick professional glance. "I heard you were back in town. Who've you got there?" "Someone who needs help," Jed replied carefully. "Bad," Doc gestured toward his examination room. "Bring her through." As Jed laid Sarah on the padded table, Doc lit an additional lamp and began his examination. His hands moved with practiced gentleness, checking pulse, breathing, the condition of her bonds and injuries. After a few minutes, he looked up at Jed with troubled eyes. "This woman's been held captive for a considerable time," he said quietly. "Months, possibly years. The scarring on her wrists suggests repeated restraint, and her muscle tone indicates prolonged immobility. She's severely malnourished and dehydrated, but she'll survive with proper care." Doc paused, studying Sarah's face more closely. "There's something familiar about her features." "Do I know this woman?" Jed's throat tightened. "Doc, what I'm about to tell you, you need to keep it between us for now. Patient confidentiality is sacred in my practice. You know that. This is Sarah Whitmore." The color drained from Doc Henley's face. He'd been the one to officially pronounce Sarah dead after the fire, based on witness accounts and the impossibility of anyone surviving the blaze. He'd signed the death certificate himself. "That's impossible," Doc whispered. "I saw the boarding house." "No one could have." "I know what we all saw," Jed interrupted. "But here she is." Doc removed his spectacles and cleaned them with shaking hands. A habit Jed remembered from childhood whenever the physician encountered something that challenged his understanding of the world. "If Sarah Whitmore is alive," Doc said slowly, "then everything we believed about that night was wrong." Heavy footsteps on the front porch announced another arrival. Sheriff Wade Morrison's distinctive knock, 3 sharp raps followed by 2 softer ones, had been his calling card for 15 years. At 45, Morrison was built like the cavalry sergeant he'd once been, with steel-grey hair and eyes that missed little. He'd taken the sheriff's job after the previous lawman died in the same fire that supposedly claimed Sarah. "Doc, you in there?" Morrison called. "Mrs. Garrett said she saw Jed Thorne carrying someone into your place." Jed looked at Doc, who nodded slightly. They'd known Wade Morrison long enough to trust his discretion, and if Sarah was in the kind of danger her condition suggested, they'd need law enforcement on their side. "Come on in." "Wade!" Doc called. Morrison entered, removing his hat as he took in the scene. His gaze settled on Sarah's unconscious form, and Jed watched recognition dawn slowly across the sheriff's weathered features. "Sweet Jesus," Morrison breathed. "Is that Sarah Whitmore?" Jed confirmed. "Very much alive." Morrison sank into Doc's spare chair as if his legs had given out. "I don't understand. The fire, we searched those ruins for days. There was no way anyone could have survived. That's what we were meant to think." Sarah's voice was barely audible, but all 3 men turned toward her as she struggled to open her eyes. The fire was meant to hide what really happened. Jed moved to her side, taking her hand gently. Her fingers were ice cold, despite the warmth of Doc's office. "Sarah, you need to rest. We can talk later." "No," she said with more strength than he'd heard from her yet. "You need to know. They'll come looking for me, and when they do..." Her voice cracked and tears began sliding down her cheeks. "Jed, I'm so sorry. For everything you must have thought, everything you went through. I never wanted you to believe I was dead." "Who's they?" Morrison asked, his lawman instincts overriding his shock. Who's been holding you, Sarah? Sarah's grip on Jed's hand tightened. People with money and power. People who don't like it when someone sees too much. She looked directly at Morrison. Sheriff, I can't tell you everything right now, but I need you to promise me something. If anything happens to me, don't trust anyone from the territorial government. No one. Morrison frowned. Sarah, if you're in danger, my job is to protect you. But I need to know what we're dealing with. I know, she whispered. Just give me time to get my strength back. Then I'll tell you everything. Her eyes found Jed's again. All of you. Doc Henley had been quiet during this exchange, but now he stepped forward. What Sarah needs right now is rest, fluids, and proper nutrition. The rest can wait until she's stronger. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of horses approaching at speed reached them through the office windows. Morrison moved to peer through the curtains, his hand instinctively moving to his gun belt. 3 riders, he reported. Well-armed, wearing suits. Not locals. Sarah struggled to sit up, panic flickering across her face. They found me. They found me already. Easy, Jed said, gently pressing her back down. Nobody's taking you anywhere. But even as he spoke the words, Jed felt the familiar weight of his Colt revolver against his hip and wondered if he was making a promise he couldn't keep. The mountain man, who'd spent 20 years avoiding trouble, was about to discover that sometimes trouble came looking for you anyway. Outside, the horses had stopped in front of Doc's office, and the sound of spurs on wooden steps suggested their visitors were coming to call. Sarah's hand found Jed's journal where it lay on the nearby chair, her fingers tracing the worn leather cover. You kept writing, she whispered, wonder in her voice. Every day, he admitted. Mostly about tracking jobs and weather. Sometimes about you. I dreamed about you, she said. In the dark places where they kept me, I dreamed about your voice, your hands, the way you used to read the mountains like other men read books. The knock on Doc's door was polite, but insistent. Morrison straightened his gun belt and looked at Jed and Doc. We're about to find out just how much trouble we're in, the sheriff said quietly. Jed stood, positioning himself between Sarah and the door. After 20 years of running from his past, he was finally ready to face whatever was coming through that door. The woman he'd loved and lost was alive, damaged but breathing. And that changed everything. His worn leather journal lay open beside her, its pages filled with 2 decades of solitary observations and carefully buried grief. But as Sarah's fingers traced the familiar handwriting, Jed realized he might finally have something worth writing about again, if they lived long enough to see tomorrow. The knock came again, more forceful this time. Morrison adjusted his badge and moved toward the door, but Sarah's sharp intake of breath stopped him cold. Wait, she whispered, struggling to sit up despite Doc's gentle, restraining hand. Let me see them first. Morrison stepped aside so Sarah could glimpse through the gap in the curtains. The color drained from her already pale face, and her hand went instinctively to her throat. It's them, she breathed. The Covenant. The what? Jed asked, but Sarah was already fumbling with something at her neck, a thin chain that had been hidden beneath her torn dress. With trembling fingers, she pulled free a silver locket, its surface scratched and dented as if it had been through hell alongside its owner. Take this. She pressed the locket into Jed's palm. Whatever happens, don't let them have it. The metal was warm from her skin, heavier than it looked. Jed could feel something rattling inside. Not the usual miniature portrait, but something else entirely. Sarah, what is this? He asked, but another knock interrupted them, this one sharp enough to rattle the door frame. Dr. Henley? A cultured voice called from outside. We're looking for a missing person, a woman who may require medical attention. Doc shot a questioning look at Morrison, who nodded grimly and opened the door just wide enough to step outside, pulling it closed behind him. Through the thin walls, they could hear the conversation clearly. Gentlemen, Morrison's voice carried the authority of his office. I'm Sheriff Morrison. What brings you to Dry Hook? Sheriff, my name is Marcus Donovan, Territorial Land Commissioner. The voice was smooth, educated, with just a hint of Eastern refinement. We're tracking a dangerous fugitive, a woman who escaped from federal custody yesterday. We have reason to believe she may have sought medical attention here. Jed felt Sarah stiffen beside him. The name Donovan clearly meant something to her, and none of it good. What's this woman wanted for? Morrison asked. Arson and murder, among other charges. She's considered extremely dangerous and should not be approached by civilians. There was a pause. Sheriff, I'm sure you understand the importance of federal cooperation in territorial matters. Sarah's grip on Jed's arm tightened. He's lying, she whispered. Donovan, he's my cousin, my father's sister's boy. But he's not here to help me. Through the walls, they heard Morrison's measured response. Well, Mr. Donovan, I haven't seen any strange women today. But if I do, I'll be sure to contact the territorial authorities through proper channels. I'm afraid that won't be sufficient. Donovan's voice had taken on a harder edge. We have information suggesting she's already been here. Perhaps the good doctor would allow us to search his premises. Not without a warrant, Doc called from inside, his usually gentle voice carrying surprising steel. Jed opened the silver locket with careful fingers. Inside, where a woman's portrait should have been, was a small, rolled piece of paper covered in tiny handwriting. But it wasn't the paper that made his blood run cold. It was the photograph tucked beneath it. The image was old, faded, but clear enough. It showed a young Sarah standing beside a tall man in a judge's robes. Behind them was a building Jed recognized, the territorial courthouse in Helena. But it was the third figure in the photograph that stopped his breath, a younger Marcus Donovan, his arm draped possessively around Sarah's shoulders. Sarah, Jed whispered. This photograph, my father, she said, tears starting to flow again. Judge William Whitmore. And yes, that's Marcus. Before he... She couldn't finish the sentence. The conversation outside was growing more heated. Morrison's voice carried a warning edge. Gentlemen, I'm going to have to ask you to state your business and move along. This is a peaceful town, and we don't take kindly to federal agents throwing their weight around without proper documentation. Sheriff Morrison. Donovan's tone had turned silky and dangerous. I hope you're not interfering with federal business. That would be most unfortunate for your career. Doc Henley had been watching Sarah carefully throughout the exchange. Now he moved to his medicine cabinet and withdrew a small vial of laudanum. Sarah, you need to tell us what's really going on here. Those men outside, they're not federal agents, are they? Sarah shook her head. The Covenant isn't part of the government. They are the government, at least out here. Marcus runs it now, ever since... She stopped, swallowing hard. Ever since they killed my father. The locket felt like it was burning in Jed's palm. He looked at the tiny paper again, squinting to make out the cramped handwriting. What he saw made his stomach drop. Sarah, this paper, it's a list of names. Land holdings. Amounts of money? He looked up at her. What is this? Evidence, she whispered. 20 years worth of evidence about what the Covenant has been doing to settlers, to native tribes, to anyone who gets in their way. My father was investigating them when they killed him. He made that list before he died. Outside, the sound of boots on wooden steps suggested Donovan and his men were preparing to leave. For now. But Morrison's voice carried clearly through the walls. Mr. Donovan, a word of advice. In Montana Territory, we handle our own law enforcement. Federal or not, you'll need more than threats to search private property in my town. Of course, Sheriff. We'll be sure to return with proper documentation. Donovan's voice carried a smile that Jed suspected was anything but friendly. In the meantime, I trust you'll contact us immediately if you encounter any dangerous fugitives. The horses moved away at a measured pace, but Jed knew they weren't really leaving. Men like that didn't give up so easily. Morrison came back inside, his face grim. Sarah, you want to explain to me why the Territorial Land Commissioner thinks you're a wanted murderer? Sarah struggled to her feet, swaying slightly as Doc moved to steady her. Because 20 years ago, I witnessed Marcus Donovan murder my father. The fire at the boarding house, it wasn't an accident. It was meant to kill me and destroy the evidence I carried. But you escaped, Jed said, pieces of the puzzle starting to fall into place. No, Sarah's voice was hollow. I didn't escape. They took me. Marcus couldn't risk killing Judge Whitmore's daughter outright. Too many questions. So they staged my death in the fire and kept me prisoner. For 20 years, Jed. 20 years of being moved from one hidden camp to another, always guarded, always watched. Doc Henley sank into his chair, the implications hitting him. The Covenant. They've been operating in this territory for 20 years. Longer, Sarah confirmed. Land fraud mostly. They identify valuable properties, mining claims, ranch land, timber rights, then find ways to force out the legal owners. Sometimes through legal manipulation, sometimes through intimidation. When that doesn't work, she touched her throat unconsciously. The boarding house fire, Morrison said slowly. There were other victims. The Henderson family, old Pete Morrison, Mrs. Chen from the laundry. Witnesses, Sarah said simply. People who had seen me with documents or who knew about my father's investigation. Marcus couldn't take any chances. Jed felt a cold rage building in his chest. All these years, he'd mourned Sarah's death, blamed himself for not being there to save her. Meanwhile, she'd been suffering in captivity while her captors walked free, probably attending church socials and territorial meetings. Why now? He asked. Why did they let you go now? Sarah's laugh was bitter. They didn't let me go. I escaped 3 days ago during a transfer between camps. The guard got careless, and I managed to slip my bonds. She touched the rope burns on her wrists. I've been running ever since, trying to get to someone who could help me, someone I could trust. And you came here, Jed said. I had nowhere else to go. Everyone I knew from before is either dead or working for them now. She looked at him with those green eyes that had haunted his dreams for 2 decades. I knew you lived somewhere in these mountains. I hoped, I prayed, that you might still be the man I remembered. The silver locket seemed to pulse in Jed's hand like a living thing. The evidence it contained could expose 20 years of corruption and murder. But it also made Sarah the most wanted woman in the territory, hunted by people with unlimited resources and no scruples about killing. Sarah, Doc said gently, if what you're saying is true, then you're in mortal danger. They'll never stop hunting you, I know, she whispered. That's why I can't stay. I won't put you all at risk. I just needed somewhere safe to rest, to figure out my next move. Jed stood abruptly, the decision crystallizing in his mind like ice on a winter pond. 20 years ago, he'd failed to protect the woman he loved. 20 years of guilt and isolation had followed that failure. He wouldn't make the same mistake twice. You're not going anywhere, he said firmly. Not alone, Sarah started to protest, but Jed cut her off. Sarah, I've spent 20 years believing you were dead. 20 years thinking I'd failed you. I'm not walking away now. Morrison adjusted his gun belt. If what Sarah's telling us is true, we're not just dealing with a few corrupt officials. We're talking about a criminal organization that's been operating with impunity for decades, which means, Doc added quietly, that they'll kill all of us to keep their secrets safe. Through the window, the late afternoon sun was casting long shadows across Dryhook's main street. Somewhere out there, Marcus Donovan and his men were planning their next move. The Covenant had had 20 years to perfect their methods, to place their people in positions of power throughout the territory. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd given Jedediah Thorne back the woman he'd thought was lost forever, and they'd done it just as the secrets of 2 decades were finally coming to light. The silver locket grew warm in his palm as Jed made his choice. Some things were worth fighting for, even against impossible odds. Some things were worth dying for. Sarah Whitmore was both. The abandoned mining cabin sat 3 miles northeast of Dryhook, hidden in a fold of granite and pine that most folks never bothered to explore. Jed had discovered it years ago during a tracking job and had since used it as a way station when the weather turned bad or when he needed solitude to think through a particularly difficult case. Now, as he helped Sarah from his horse in the gathering dusk, the cabin represented something more precious than shelter. It was sanctuary. It's not much, Jed said, shouldering his pack and Sarah's few belongings. But it's safe. No one knows about this place except me. Sarah stood unsteadily, her legs still weak from years of confinement. The ride from town had been slow and careful, with frequent stops to let her rest. Each mile had taken them deeper into country that Jed knew like the lines on his own hands, but that would be treacherous for anyone trying to follow. "It's perfect," she said, looking around at the small clearing surrounded by towering pines. I'd forgotten what it felt like to be somewhere without bars on the windows. Inside, the cabin was spartanly furnished, but clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a simple wooden table and 2 chairs nearby. A single bed occupied the far corner, covered with warm quilts that Jed had traded for in town. Oil lamps provided gentle light, and shelves along the walls held supplies: dried food, ammunition, medical supplies, and books. Sarah moved slowly around the space, touching things with the wonder of someone rediscovering the world. She paused at a shelf of books, running her fingers along the spines. "You always did love to read," she said softly. "I remember you carrying books in your saddlebags even on hunting trips. Helps pass the long winter nights," Jed replied, building up the fire. "Some of those are new. Some I've had since before." As flames began to dance in the fireplace, Sarah settled carefully into one of the chairs. The warmth seemed to revive her slightly, bringing color back to her pale cheeks. "Jed," she said, "I need to tell you about that night. The night of the fire. You deserve to know what really happened." Jed paused in his work, a piece of kindling forgotten in his hands. For 20 years he'd imagined that night in 100 different ways, always wondering if there was something he could have done differently. "My father had been investigating land fraud for months," Sarah began, her voice steady but distant. "Settlers were losing their claims to mysterious legal challenges. Mining rights were being transferred to companies that didn't exist on paper. Native tribes were being forced off treaty lands by men who claimed federal authority." She pulled the silver locket from her dress and opened it, withdrawing the tiny rolled paper. "This list contains names, dates, amounts of money. It represents millions of acres of stolen land and thousands of displaced families." Jed moved his chair closer to hers, studying the cramped handwriting in the firelight. The names were a mixture of officials he recognized and companies he'd never heard of. The amounts of money were staggering. "Your father was building a case," he said. "More than that. He was planning to present evidence to the territorial governor, maybe even take it to Washington. Marcus knew about the investigation. He was pretending to help, feeding my father information while actually spying on him." Sarah's voice grew harder. "That night I was supposed to meet my father at his office. He'd promised to show me something important, something that would change everything," he said. "But when I got there," she stopped, her hands trembling slightly. Jed reached over and covered them with his own. "Marcus was there," she continued, "standing over my father's body. There was blood on his hands, on his clothes. He looked up at me and smiled, Jed. He actually smiled." "Jesus," Jed breathed. "I ran, grabbed the papers my father had been working on, and ran as fast as I could. Marcus shouted for his men, but I knew the alleys behind the courthouse better than they did. I made it to the boarding house and barricaded myself in my room." Sarah's eyes reflected the firelight as she relived that terrible night. "I thought I was safe. Thought I could wait until morning and then go to Sheriff Patterson. He was an honest man, would have listened to me. But then I smelled smoke. They set the fire to flush you out, to kill me and destroy the evidence. But they miscalculated. I got out through the back window, but Marcus was waiting. He grabbed me before I could scream." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "That's when he told me about his plan. Couldn't just murder Judge Whitmore's daughter outright. Too many questions. But if I died in a tragic fire along with the evidence, well, that was just an unfortunate accident." Jed felt his jaw clench. "So they staged your death, left some of my belongings in the ruins, let people assume I'd been trapped inside. Meanwhile, I was already miles away, drugged and tied in the back of a wagon." Sarah's laugh was bitter. "Marcus visited me a few times over the years just to gloat. Told me how the Covenant was expanding, how my father's death had actually helped them by eliminating their biggest threat. The faded wanted poster that Morrison had shown them earlier made sense now. Jed pulled it from his coat pocket, studying the young woman's face in the lamplight. This poster, they made you into the criminal. Official story was that I killed my father in a rage over his will, then set the fire to cover my tracks. Marcus had witnesses who swore they saw me arguing with my father that day. All lies, but convincing lies. Sarah stood and moved to the window, looking out at the darkening forest. For 20 years, I've been a wanted murderer. Anyone who helps me becomes an accessory. Anyone who believes my story becomes a target. Jed joined her at the window. Sarah, look at me. She turned, and he saw the fear in her eyes, not just of Marcus and the Covenant, but of dragging him into danger. I spent 20 years thinking you were dead, he said firmly. 20 years believing I'd failed to save you. I'm not walking away now, just because there's danger involved. You don't understand what you're up against. The Covenant has people everywhere. Law enforcement, territorial government, business leaders. They have unlimited money and no conscience about using it. Then we'd better be smarter than they are. From his pack, Jed withdrew a bottle of whiskey and 2 tin cups. He poured a small amount into each cup and handed one to Sarah. To Judge William Whitmore, he said, raising his cup. And to making sure his daughter gets the justice she deserves. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she managed a smile as she touched her cup to his. To my father. And to the stubborn mountain man who still believes in doing what's right, as they sipped the whiskey in comfortable silence. Jed felt something he hadn't experienced in 20 years. Purpose beyond mere survival. Sarah was alive, and she carried the evidence to expose decades of corruption and murder. It wouldn't be easy, and it might cost them both their lives, but some fights were worth having. Outside, an owl called from the darkness, and the wind whispered through the pines. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers. But tonight, in this hidden sanctuary, Sarah Whitmore was safe and free for the first time in 20 years. It was a start. Dawn found Jed studying his father's brass compass by the dying firelight, its needle wavering restlessly as if it couldn't decide which way was true north. The compass had been unreliable for as long as he could remember. A family joke that became a family treasure after his father died in the war. That compass is like life, son, his father had said. Sometimes the needle spins, but a man still has to choose his direction. Sarah stirred in the bed where she'd finally found peaceful sleep. The first in 20 years, without bars on the windows or guards outside the door. Jed had spent the night in the chair, listening to every sound the forest made. His rifle within easy reach. You didn't sleep, Sarah observed, sitting up slowly and pushing hair from her face. Slept enough. Jed closed the compass and slipped it back into his vest pocket. How are you feeling? Stronger. Still weak, but stronger. She stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the morning mist rising from the valley below. Jed, I need to tell you about the Covenant. About what they really are. Over breakfast, dried meat, hardtack, and coffee that could float a horseshoe, Sarah began revealing the scope of the organization that had held her prisoner. It started small, maybe 30 years ago. A group of businessmen and politicians who wanted to control Western expansion for their own profit. They realized that if they could manipulate land ownership, mineral rights, and territorial legislation, they could become incredibly wealthy. She traced patterns in the wooden table with her finger as she spoke. At first it was just corruption, bribes, forged documents, intimidation. But as the stakes grew higher, so did their methods. Murder became routine. Entire families would disappear if they posed a threat. How many people are we talking about? Jed asked. In the Covenant itself, maybe 50 core members across the Western Territories. But they have hundreds of associates. Judges, sheriffs, land office clerks, mining company foremen. People who don't necessarily know about the murders, but who profit from the fraud. Jed refilled her coffee cup, noting how her hands had stopped shaking. Rest and safety were working their magic. During my captivity, I was moved between camps throughout Montana, Wyoming, and Colorado territories. They kept me alive because Marcus was paranoid, afraid that someday they might need me to sign documents or provide testimony that would legitimize their claims to my father's estate. Your father's estate? Sarah's expression darkened. Judge Whitmore owned significant property, ranch land, timber rights, mining claims he'd acquired through legitimate means over the years. When he died, that property should have passed to me. Instead, Marcus used forged documents to claim it for the covenant. The brass compass seemed to grow heavier in Jed's pocket as he processed the implications. Sarah, if you're the rightful heir to all that property, then proving my identity and exposing the covenant would invalidate decades of their transactions. Hundreds of thousands of acres would revert to legitimate owners. Mining companies would lose their claims. Railroad routes would have to be renegotiated. She looked up at him. We're not just talking about justice for my father's murder. We're talking about dismantling the entire corrupt system they've built. A sound from outside made them both freeze, horses approaching at a steady pace. Jed moved to the window, keeping low as he peered through the gap in the curtains. 3 riders, he whispered, but not Covenant. I know one of them. Relief flooded through him as he recognized the lead rider, Emma Clearwater, who ran the general store in Dry Hook and served as unofficial liaison between the town and the local Cherokee families. Behind her rode 2 Cherokee men he didn't recognize, but their bearing suggested they were warriors. Jed opened the cabin door as Emma dismounted. At 42, she was a handsome woman with intelligent dark eyes and graying black hair braided with silver ornaments. Her mixed Cherokee and Irish heritage had made her an outsider in some circles, but her fierce intelligence and fair dealing had earned respect throughout the territory. Jed, she said without preamble, we need to talk. Emma, it's good to see you, but this isn't a good time. It's about the woman you're hiding. The one Marcus Donovan is hunting. Emma's expression was grim. Word travels fast in Indian country. We know who she is. Sarah appeared in the doorway, and Emma's breath caught. Sarah Whitmore. I'll be damned. Emma had been barely 20 when Sarah disappeared, but she remembered the fire and its aftermath. We all thought you were dead. That was the idea, Sarah replied. Emma, how much do you know about what's been happening? Emma gestured to her companions. This is Joseph Standing Bear and his son Michael. Their family lost their treaty land to a mining company 5 years ago. Same company that's been gobbling up Cherokee property all through this region. Joseph Standing Bear was a man of perhaps 50, with weathered features and eyes that missed nothing. His son Michael was younger, maybe 30, with the build of a warrior and the watchful stillness that came from living in hostile territory. The company calls itself Montana Mineral Development, Joseph said. His English precise despite a slight accent. But the papers were signed by men from something called the Covenant. Sarah and Jed exchanged glances. How do you know that name? Sarah asked. Because my family has been tracking their activities for years, Michael replied. They've displaced dozens of Cherokee families, always using legal technicalities and forged documents. We've been gathering evidence, but we needed someone who understood their inner workings. Emma stepped forward. Sarah, these men represent more than just their own families. There's a network of displaced people throughout the territory. Cherokee, white settlers, Mexican landowners, even some German immigrants. All victims of the same corrupt system. What are you proposing? Jed asked, though he suspected he already knew. Alliance, Joseph said simply. You have evidence of their crimes. We have knowledge of their current operations and safe places to hide. Together, we might have enough to bring them down. Sarah studied the 3 newcomers, weighing her options. What you're talking about would make you all targets. The Covenant doesn't hesitate to kill entire families. They've already taken our land, Michael said. Destroyed our communities. What do we have left to lose? Emma pulled a small cloth pouch from her belt, intricately beaded Cherokee work that seemed to shimmer in the morning light. This belonged to my grandmother. She said it would protect those who fought for justice. She held it out to Sarah. I think she'd want you to have it. Sarah accepted the medicine pouch with reverence, understanding its significance. Emma, if we do this, if we really try to expose the Covenant, there's no going back. They'll come after all of us. Then we'd better make sure we get them first, Emma replied. Jed pulled out his father's compass again, watching the needle spin uncertainly. Sometimes choosing direction meant accepting that the path ahead would be dangerous and unclear. "All right," he said finally. "If we're going to do this, we do it right. No half measures, no backing down once we start." Sarah clutched the medicine pouch to her chest, drawing strength from its ancient power. For the first time in 20 years, she wasn't facing the Covenant alone. The war for justice was about to begin. The surveyor's map that Sarah produced from her hidden belongings 3 days later changed everything. Spread across the cabin's wooden table, the detailed territorial chart showed boundary lines that existed nowhere in official records, a shadow. Geography of corruption that stretched across 3 territories. "My father had this, made by a surveyor he trusted," Sarah explained, her finger tracing the red ink marks that indicated fraudulent claims. "Every mark represents stolen land. Every line represents a family destroyed." Jed studied the map with the eye of a man who'd spent decades reading the mountains. What he saw made his blood run cold. His own property, the remote cabin where they now sat, plus nearly 1,000 acres of mountain wilderness he'd bought with his army pension, was outlined in red. "They're planning to take my land too," he said quietly. Emma leaned over the map, her dark eyes following the network of false boundaries. "This section here, that's where Joseph's family had their ranch. And this area marked in blue, that's supposed to be railroad right-of-way, but there's no railroad planned for that route." "There will be," Sarah said grimly. "The Covenant doesn't just steal land, they create demand for it afterward. They'll announce railroad plans, mining discoveries or cattle routes that suddenly make their stolen property incredibly valuable." Michael Standing Bear pointed to a cluster of markings near the Little Bighorn River. 12 Cherokee families lost their treaty rights in this area last year. "The agent said it was a federal decision, but we could never find the paperwork because it doesn't exist," Sarah confirmed. "Marcus has people in the Bureau of Indian Affairs who create false orders. The real federal government never knows what's happening until it's too late to reverse." Jed rolled up the map carefully, understanding now why Sarah had been kept alive for 20 years. This document represented evidence of crimes spanning decades, touching hundreds of thousands of acres and thousands of lives. "We need to get this to someone who can act on it," he said. "But who?" "If the Covenant has people throughout the territorial government, there's a federal judge in Denver," Emma suggested. "Judge Harrison. He's got a reputation for honesty, and he's outside the territorial system." Sarah shook her head. "Harrison died last month. Heart attack supposedly, but the timing was suspicious. He'd been asking uncomfortable questions about land transfers in Montana Territory. The weight of their situation settled over the group like morning fog. The Covenant had had 20 years to place their people in positions of power, to eliminate threats, to perfect their system of corruption. "There has to be someone," Jed said. "Some authority figure they haven't bought or intimidated." A knock at the cabin door made everyone freeze. But it was Sheriff Morrison's distinctive pattern. 3 sharp raps, 2 soft ones. Jed opened the door to find the lawman looking haggard and worried. "Wade," Jed said. "What brings you up here?" "Trouble," Morrison replied, removing his hat as he entered. "Bad trouble." Morrison's presence filled the small cabin as he studied the map, still partially visible on the table. His weathered face grew grim as he recognized the implications. "Sarah, I need to tell you something. After you left town, I did some digging into Marcus Donovan's background. What I found scared the hell out of me." "Tell us," Sarah said. Morrison pulled a folded paper from his coat. "Donovan's not just territorial land commissioner. He's also a federal marshal, appointed directly by Washington. He has authority that supersedes mine in virtually every situation." "Meaning?" Jed asked, though he suspected he knew. "Meaning if he decides you're all fugitives from federal justice, I can't legally protect you. He can deputize anyone he wants, requisition supplies from any town, even call in military support if he claims it's a matter of territorial security." Emma's jaw tightened. "So we're not just fighting corrupt businessmen. We're fighting people with federal authority. It gets worse," Morrison continued. I sent a telegram to Denver trying to verify Donovan's credentials. Got a response this morning saying the inquiry was being forwarded to the appropriate authorities. 3 hours later, Donovan himself walked into my office. Sarah's face went pale. He knows you're investigating him. More than that, he knows I'm in contact with you. He didn't say it directly, but the threat was clear. Cooperate or face federal charges for harboring a fugitive. Jed moved to the window, scanning the forest for any sign of watchers. How long before he makes his move? Soon. He's brought in more men, at least a dozen, all armed and organized like military. They're camped outside town, officially waiting for additional federal support to arrive. The brass compass felt heavy in Jed's pocket as he weighed their options. Every choice led to danger, but some dangers were worse than others. Wade, he said finally, I need to ask you something, and I need an honest answer. When you took the oath as sheriff, did you mean it? Morrison's eyes hardened. Every word. Then you know what you have to do. And you know it might cost you everything. The sheriff was quiet for a long moment, studying the faces around the table. These people were asking him to risk his career, his life, maybe even his family's safety. But the map on the table told a story of injustice that went far beyond personal risk. 20 years ago, I failed to protect this town from the fire that supposedly killed Sarah, Morrison said slowly. I was young, inexperienced, and I let powerful men convince me to look the other way. I've regretted it every day since. He looked directly at Sarah. I won't make that mistake again. Wade, Sarah said softly, if you help us, you become a target too. The Covenant doesn't make distinctions between enemies and inconvenient witnesses. Then I guess I'd better choose my side carefully. Morrison gestured to the map. How many families are represented on that thing? How many people have lost their homes, their livelihoods, maybe their lives because of Covenant corruption? Hundreds, Emma replied. Maybe thousands over the years, Morrison nodded grimly. Then it's time someone with a badge stood up for them. Outside, the afternoon sun was slanting through the pine trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. Somewhere beyond those shadows, Marcus Donovan was gathering his forces for what would surely be a final confrontation. But inside the cabin, 5 people had just made a choice that would change the balance of power in Montana Territory. The evidence was gathered, the alliances were formed, and the battle lines were drawn. Sarah clutched Emma's medicine pouch as she studied the surveyor's map one more time. For 20 years, she'd been a victim of the Covenant's crimes. Now finally she had the tools and the allies to fight back. The question was whether they were already too late. Emma's Cherokee medicine pouch seemed to pulse with ancient power as she held it during the dawn ceremony 3 days later. The small clearing behind the cabin had been transformed into a sacred space, with stones arranged in a circle and sweet-smelling sage burning in a small fire pit. My grandmother taught me that when facing great evil, we must call upon all our ancestors for strength, Emma said, her voice carrying the rhythmic cadence of traditional storytelling. The spirits of those who fought injustice before us. Sarah knelt beside the fire, the medicine pouch warm against her palm. For 20 years, she'd been cut off from any source of spiritual strength, surviving on nothing but stubborn will and the fading memory of her father's love. Now, surrounded by allies who believed in her cause, she felt something she'd almost forgotten: hope. Joseph Standing Bear spoke in Cherokee, his words flowing like water over stone. Though Sarah couldn't understand the language, she felt the power behind his prayer, the connection to generations of people who'd fought to protect their land and their families. He's asking the spirits to guide our path and protect us from those who would destroy the sacred balance. Michael translated quietly. He's also asking for the strength to do what must be done, even if it costs us everything. After the ceremony, they returned to the cabin where Morrison was waiting with troubling news. His face was grim as he spread a collection of papers across the table. I've been in contact with Cherokee families throughout the territory, he said. The pattern is always the same: legal challenges to treaty rights, followed by forced removal, followed by mysterious transfers of the land to Covenant-controlled companies. Emma studied the documents with growing anger. This family here, the Crow Dogs, they were moved off their land last winter. Told it was temporary while a boundary dispute was resolved. That was 8 months ago. Where are they now? Sarah asked. Reservation land in the eastern part of the territory. Overcrowded, poor soil, no game. Half the children are sick, and the adults are forbidden from leaving without permission. Jed felt his jaw clench. It's not just theft. It's genocide. Slow genocide, Michael agreed. Break up the communities, scatter the families, destroy the traditional ways of life. In 2 generations, there won't be enough Cherokee left to remember what we lost. Sarah stood and moved to the window, her hand instinctively going to the silver locket at her throat. The list my father compiled, it includes payments to Bureau of Indian Affairs officials, amounts that match up with land transfers throughout the territory. He knew, Morrison said. Judge Whitmore was investigating the systematic destruction of native communities. That's why they killed him, Sarah said. Not just because he threatened their profits, but because he was documenting their methods. If his evidence had reached Washington, it still can, Emma interrupted. Sarah, you're not just a witness to your father's murder. You're the keeper of evidence that could save thousands of lives. But even as Emma spoke those words of hope, the sound of approaching horses reached them through the forest. Many horses moving with military precision. Jed grabbed his rifle and moved to the window. What he saw made his blood run cold. At least 20 riders were surrounding the cabin, spread out in a perfect circle to prevent escape. At their head rode Marcus Donovan, his expensive suit somehow remaining immaculate despite the rough mountain travel. Sarah Whitmore! Donovan's voice carried easily across the clearing. I know you're in there. Come out peacefully, and your friends won't be harmed. Sarah's hand tightened on the medicine pouch. He's lying. The moment I step outside, he'll kill all of you to eliminate witnesses. Morrison checked his revolver, his face grim. And how many rounds do we have between us? Not enough, Jed replied, counting the armed men outside. Not nearly enough. Michael Standing Bear moved silently to the back window. There's a deer path that leads down to the creek. If we can reach the water, we might be able to lose them in the heavy timber beyond. Sarah! Donovan called again. You have 1 minute to surrender, or I'll order my men to burn the cabin with all of you inside. Wouldn't want history to repeat itself, would we? The reference to the boarding house fire 20 years ago sent rage coursing through Jed's veins. This man had orchestrated Sarah's torment, had kept her prisoner for 2 decades, and now he was threatening to finish what he'd started. There's another option, Sarah said quietly. I could surrender. Give myself up to save the rest of you. No, Jed said firmly. We're not losing you again. Emma opened her medicine pouch and withdrew a small piece of turquoise, polished smooth by generations of handling. My grandmother told me this stone could turn aside bullets and evil intentions. She wore it during the troubles of 1863, when the army tried to force our people onto the reservation. She pressed the stone into Sarah's hand. Today you carry our ancestors' protection. The sound of glass breaking came from the front of the cabin as one of Donovan's men shot out a window. They were running out of time. The back path, Morrison decided. Sarah, you go first with Michael. Emma and Joseph follow. Jed and I will cover your escape. I'm not leaving you to face them alone, Sarah protested. You're not leaving us, Jed said, moving to her side and taking her face in his hands. You're carrying the evidence that will destroy them. You're carrying justice for your father and all the families they've destroyed. He kissed her then, quick and fierce, pouring 20 years of love and loss into that single moment. Get to Denver. Find someone in the federal government who can't be bought. Make sure the world knows what the Covenant has done. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. The weight of her father's evidence, the medicine pouch, and the hopes of countless displaced families settled on her shoulders like a sacred burden. 30 seconds. Donovan shouted from outside. Michael had the back window open, scanning the forest beyond for the safest route. Joseph was gathering supplies into a travel pack with practiced efficiency. Emma stood beside Sarah, her presence a source of strength and calm. Sarah, Emma said quietly, Whatever happens here, remember, you're not alone anymore. You carry the prayers of many people with you. The first gunshot shattered the morning air, followed immediately by the sharp crack of splintering wood as bullets tore into the cabin's front wall. "Go!" Morrison shouted, returning fire through the broken window. Sarah squeezed Jed's hand one last time, then followed Michael through the back window into the forest beyond. Emma and Joseph disappeared after them, moving with the silent grace of people who'd learned to survive in hostile territory. Jed watched until they were safely into the tree line, then turned back to help Morrison hold off Donovan's assault. The medicine pouch's ancient power was gone, carried away with Sarah toward whatever future awaited them all. But as bullets flew and smoke filled the cabin, Jed felt something he hadn't experienced in 20 years, the satisfaction of fighting for something that truly mattered. The blood-stained deed that Sarah pulled from her father's, hidden safe 3 weeks later, changed everything they thought. They knew about the Covenant's crimes. She'd led Michael and Emma through mountain paths known only to hunters and trappers, eventually reaching the ruins of her childhood home, Judge Whitmore's estate, officially destroyed in an accidental fire 2 years after Sarah's disappearance. But the safe had survived, hidden beneath the stone foundation where her father had concealed his most important documents. Sarah's hands shook as she worked the combination, muscle memory guiding her fingers through the sequence her father had made her memorize as a child. Her mother's birthday. Reversed, the metal door swung open with a rusty groan, revealing papers that had waited 22 years for Sarah's return. "Sweet Mother of God," Emma breathed, as Sarah unfolded the deed with infinite care. The document was thick parchment, official territorial seal still intact, despite water stains that looked suspiciously like dried blood. But it wasn't the deed itself that made Sarah's world tilt sideways. It was the signature at the bottom, written in her father's careful script just hours before his death. "I, Judge William Whitmore, being of sound mind and body, do hereby transfer all property, mineral rights, and territorial holdings to my daughter Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore, to be held in trust for the displaced families of Montana Territory." Sarah sank to her knees among the charred timbers of her childhood home. He knew he was going to die. This is dated the same day Marcus killed him. Michael, standing bare, examined the deed with the reverence due a sacred object. "Sarah, do you understand what this means? According to this document, you're not just the rightful heir to your father's property. You're the legal trustee for land that should belong to hundreds of displaced families." Emma's eyes widened as she read over Michael's shoulder. The mineral rights alone, gold claims, silver mines, coal deposits. We're talking about millions of dollars in stolen wealth. But Sarah was staring at something else, a smaller document tucked behind the deed. Her father's final letter, written in the hours before his death. "My dearest Sarah, if you are reading this, then the worst has come to pass. Marcus Donovan is not merely a corrupt official. He is my nephew, my sister's son, and he has been systematically destroying our family's legacy for his own gain. The Covenant is his creation, built on the foundation of our family's murdered reputation. He killed your mother, Sarah. The fever that took her when you were 10. It was poison administered slowly over months. He needed her dead to consolidate control of the family assets. I've spent 12 years gathering proof, waiting for the right moment to expose him. That moment has come, but I fear I will not live to see justice done. You are the last of our bloodline, the final threat to his empire. Stay hidden, stay alive, and when the time is right, reclaim what is ours. Your loving father, William." The letter fluttered from Sarah's numb fingers. 20 years of captivity suddenly made terrible sense. Marcus hadn't just been eliminating a witness to murder. He'd been destroying the last obstacle to his inheritance of the entire Whitmore fortune. "He's my cousin," Sarah whispered. "And he killed my mother." The implications hit them all at once. This wasn't just territorial corruption or land fraud. This was a family war spanning decades, with Marcus systematically murdering his own relatives to steal their inheritance. "The Covenant," Sarah said, pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. It's not some criminal organization. It's Marcus's personal empire, built on my family's stolen wealth. Emma knelt beside Sarah, her presence steady and comforting. How much property are we talking about? Sarah consulted the deed with growing amazement. 60,000 acres of ranch land. Mining claims throughout 3 territories. Timber rights. Railroad easements. She looked up at her friends. According to this document, Marcus has been operating his entire criminal enterprise on stolen land. Michael's warrior instincts were already calculating the strategic implications. If you can prove your identity and the legitimacy of this deed, every land transaction the Covenant has made becomes invalid, Sarah finished. Every mining operation, every railroad deal, every displacement of Cherokee families, all of it built on property that was never legally theirs to sell. But Emma was studying the bloodstains on the deed with a forensic eye. Sarah, this blood, it's not just from handling. Someone bled on this document deliberately. Sarah examined the stains more closely. They formed a pattern near her father's signature, as if someone had pressed a wounded hand against the parchment. My father's blood, she realized. He was dying when he signed this. Marcus must have tortured him, trying to get him to reveal where he'd hidden the evidence. The sound of approaching horses made them all freeze. But these riders weren't moving with military precision. They were riding hard and fast. Like men fleeing for their lives, Jed's voice carried across the ruins as he and Morrison emerged from the tree line. Their horses lathered with sweat and their faces grim with urgency. Sarah, thank God you're alive. Jed dismounted and swept her into his arms, relief and desperation warring in his embrace. What happened at the cabin? Emma asked. Morrison's answer chilled them all. Donovan didn't just want to capture Sarah. He wanted to eliminate everyone who'd seen the evidence. After you escaped, he ordered his men to burn the cabin and hunt down anyone who got away. How did you escape? Michael asked. Old mining tunnels, Jed replied. I remembered a shaft that connected to natural caves beneath the mountain. We held them off long enough to reach the tunnels, then used them to get clear. Morrison was examining the deed over Sarah's shoulder, his lawman's mind grasping the implications immediately. Sarah, this changes everything. With this document, you're not just a witness to the Covenant's crimes. You're the legal owner of most of the property they've been using as their base of operations, which means, Emma added grimly, that Marcus will do anything to prevent this deed from becoming public knowledge. Sarah clutched the blood-stained document to her chest, feeling the weight of her father's sacrifice and her family's legacy. For 20 years, she'd been a victim, a prisoner, a fugitive. But this deed transformed her into something far more dangerous to the Covenant, a threat to their very existence. There's more, Jed said quietly. Before we escaped the cabin, I overheard Donovan talking to his lieutenants. They're not just planning to eliminate us. They're planning to stage a Cherokee uprising. Michael's face went hard as granite. What do you mean? False flag operation. They'll attack white settlements using Cherokee weapons and tactics, then use the uprising as justification for military intervention. Every Cherokee family in the territory will be rounded up and forcibly relocated. Genocide, Joseph Standing Bear said simply. They're planning genocide to cover their tracks. Sarah stood slowly, the deed still pressed against her heart. The game had changed completely. This wasn't just about exposing past crimes anymore. It was about preventing future atrocities on a massive scale. When? She asked. 3 days, Morrison replied. They're waiting for additional federal troops to arrive from Fort Ellis. Once they have enough firepower, they'll launch simultaneous attacks on homesteads throughout the valley. Emma's medicine pouch seemed to grow heavier at her belt as she contemplated the scope of the threat. Hundreds of innocent people will die. Cherokee families will be blamed and destroyed. And in the chaos, all evidence of the Covenant's crimes will disappear. Sarah looked around at the ruins of her childhood home, then at the faces of the people who'd risked everything to help her. The blood-stained deed in her hands represented, more than her family's legacy, it was the key to saving countless lives. Then, we have 3 days to stop them, she said with quiet. determination. The plot twist was complete. What had begun as a personal quest for justice had transformed into a desperate race to prevent genocide. And the weapon they needed to stop Marcus Donovan was written in her father's blood on a deed that made Sarah Whitmore one of the wealthiest landowners in Montana Territory, if she lived long enough to claim it. The cavalry saber felt strange in Jed's hands after 20 years of peace. He'd buried the weapon after the war, sworn he'd never take up arms again except to hunt game or defend against wild animals. But as he cleaned the blade by lamplight in their new hideout, an abandoned Cherokee ceremonial cave deep in the Absaroka Mountains, he accepted that some oaths were meant to be broken. "You sure about this?" Morrison asked, checking his rifle for the dozenth time since they'd begun planning their assault on Dryhook's old church. "No," Jed replied honestly. "But I'm sure about what happens if we don't try." 2 days had passed since they'd discovered the blood-stained deed, and their small band of allies had grown to nearly 30 people. Word had spread through the Cherokee communities with the speed of wildfire. Sarah Whitmore was alive. She carried proof of the Covenant's crimes, and she was planning to take back what was stolen. Emma moved between the various groups like a general preparing for battle, coordinating supply lines and escape routes with the efficiency of someone who'd spent her lifetime navigating hostile territory. The medicine pouch at her belt had become a symbol of hope for the displaced families, proof that someone finally stood ready to fight for justice. "The church is where this all began," Sarah said, studying hand-drawn maps of Dryhook that Michael had sketched from memory. 22 years ago, my father held his final meeting with trusted allies in that church basement. He was planning to hide the original deed there, in the space beneath the altar, until he could safely transport it to federal authorities. Joseph, standing bare, traced the building's outline with a weathered finger. "If the deed is still there, it's there," Sarah said with quiet certainty. "My father was a methodical man. He would have wrapped it in oiled cloth, sealed it in a metal box, and hidden it where only family could find it." Doc Henley looked up from his medical supplies, his face showing the strain of the past week. "Sarah, even if we recover the original deed, how do we get it to authorities who can act on it? Every territorial official could be compromised." "We don't take it to territorial authorities," Sarah replied. "We take it directly to Washington. To President Grant himself, if necessary." The plan they'd developed was audacious in its simplicity. While Donovan's forces prepared for their false flag operation against Cherokee settlements, Sarah's group would strike at the heart of Covenant. Power, the church where her father had died, and where the evidence of 20 years of crimes lay buried, but it was Michael standing bare, who'd identified the plan's greatest weakness. "Donovan won't leave the church unguarded. He knows you'll eventually come for whatever your father hid there. How many men do you think he'll post?" Morrison asked. "Enough to stop us," Emma replied grimly. "Marcus isn't stupid. He knows this is his last chance to eliminate the evidence and the witnesses." Jed tested the cavalry saber's balance, muscle memory returning despite the passage of years. The blade had seen action at Antietam and Gettysburg, had tasted Confederate blood in defense of the Union. Now it would taste blood again. This time in defense of justice itself. "There's something else we need to consider," Sarah said quietly. "If we succeed in exposing the Covenant, Marcus won't just disappear quietly. He'll try to destroy as much evidence as possible, which means he'll kill anyone who can testify against him." Morrison finished. "Every Cherokee family they've displaced, every settler who's lost land, every witness to their crimes." The weight of that responsibility settled over the group like mountain mist. They weren't just fighting for Sarah's vindication or the recovery of stolen property. They were fighting to prevent a massacre that could claim hundreds of lives. Emma opened her medicine pouch and withdrew a small bundle of sage, lighting it in the cave's central fire. As sweet smoke filled the space, she began speaking in Cherokee, her voice carrying the cadence of ancient prayers. "She's asking the spirits of our ancestors to guide our weapons and protect the innocent," Joseph translated. She's also asking for courage to do what must be done, even if it costs us our lives. Sarah knelt beside the fire, the blood-stained deed pressed against her heart. In the flickering light, she looked like a warrior priestess preparing for battle, her green eyes reflecting flames and determination in equal measure. My father spent his life believing that justice would prevail through legal means, she said. He died because he trusted in the law and the goodness of men. I won't make his mistake. Doc Henley finished organizing his medical supplies, bandages, laudanum for pain, needle and thread for stitching wounds. I've patched up gunshot wounds before, but never for a full battle. Are we sure there's no other way? 20 years I've looked for another way, Sarah replied. 20 years of hoping someone else would expose the truth, that justice would somehow find its way to Montana territory. But justice doesn't come to those who wait for it. Justice comes to those who fight for it. Jed sheathed the cavalry saber and moved to Sarah's side. When we get to the church, you stay back until we've secured the building. Let us handle the fighting. No, Sarah said firmly. This is my father's fight, my family's legacy. I won't hide while others shed blood for my cause. Sarah, Jed, for 20 years I've been a victim, a prisoner, a fugitive. Tomorrow, I reclaim my identity as Judge William Whitmore's daughter and the rightful heir to everything the Covenant has stolen. Her voice carried steel that hadn't been there weeks ago. I'll not dishonor my father's memory by cowering when the moment of truth arrives. Emma finished her ceremony and joined them beside the fire. The Cherokee families are ready. Those who can fight will create diversions throughout the territory, drawing Covenant forces away from Dryhook. Those who can't fight will be hidden in sacred places where white men fear to go. And if we fail, Morrison asked, then we die fighting, Michael replied simply. Better to die standing than to live kneeling. As the night deepened, they made final preparations for the assault. Weapons were cleaned and loaded, supplies packed for quick movement, escape routes memorized. Doc Henley mixed medicines that would dull pain and prevent infection. Emma created additional medicine pouches for each fighter, small bits of protection blessed by ancestral spirits. But it was Sarah who performed the most crucial preparation. In the privacy of the cave's deepest chamber, she opened her father's letter one final time, memorizing every word of his final message to her. The letter spoke of love and loss, of justice delayed but not denied. It spoke of the burden of carrying forward a family's honor when all seemed lost. Most importantly, it spoke of the choice every generation must make, to stand against evil or to let it flourish through inaction. I choose to stand, Sarah whispered to the cave walls, her father's words echoing back to her from stone that had sheltered her Cherokee allies for generations. When she rejoined the group, Jed saw something new in her eyes, not just determination or courage, but the calm certainty of someone who had accepted their destiny. Sarah Whitmore was no longer running from her past. She was running toward it, toward the final confrontation that would either restore justice to Montana territory or see her join her father in death. The cavalry saber at Jed's side seemed to hum with anticipation as he watched Sarah study the church maps one final time. Tomorrow would bring violence, blood, and quite possibly death for them all. But it would also bring the reckoning that had been 20 years in the coming. In the morning, they would ride to Dryhook. They would enter the church where Judge William Whitmore had died, and they would either recover the evidence that could destroy the Covenant forever, or they would die in the attempt, as Sarah folded the maps and prepared for what might be her final night of sleep. Jed made a silent promise to his old cavalry saber. If violence was coming, if blood must be shed for justice to prevail, then let it be swift and let it be final. The war for Montana Territory's soul would begin at dawn. The church bell began tolling at dawn, its bronze voice carrying across Dryhook with the weight of prophecy. Sarah recognized the pattern immediately. 3 long peals, followed by 2 short ones, repeated endlessly. It was the signal her father had taught her as a child, the code that meant danger comes, but hope endures. Someone's ringing the warning, she said. her heart racing as she checked her rifle one final time. From their position in the hills, overlooking the town, Jed could see the chaos beginning to unfold in Dry Hook's streets. Donovan's men were running toward predetermined positions, clearly surprised by the early warning. The false flag operation against Cherokee settlements wasn't scheduled to begin until noon, but someone had decided to accelerate the timeline. "Doc Henley," Morrison said grimly, recognizing the steady rhythm of the bell. "He's warning the whole territory that trouble's coming." The bronze church bell continued its urgent tolling as Sarah led her small assault team down the hillside toward Dry Hook's outskirts. Behind them, Emma and Joseph were leading the larger group of Cherokee warriors towards strategic positions throughout the town, ready to create the diversions that would draw Covenant forces away from the church. But as they approached the building where her father had died 22 years ago, Sarah saw that Marcus had anticipated their move. At least a dozen armed men surrounded the church, positioned with military precision to cover every approach. "He knows we're coming," Michael observed, studying the defensive positions through a spyglass. "Of course he does," Sarah replied. "Marcus has always been 3 steps ahead of everyone else. But this time, he's made a mistake." Jed looked at her questioningly, and Sarah pointed to the bell tower, where Doc Henley was still pulling the rope with determined rhythm, despite the bullets beginning to fly around him. "The bell," she said. "Marcus doesn't understand its significance. He thinks it's just an old man making noise. But that bell is calling every honest person in Dry Hook to witness what happens here today." As if summoned by her words, townspeople began emerging from their homes and businesses. Not many, most were too frightened of Covenant retribution to take sides openly. But enough. The blacksmith appeared with a shotgun. The general store owner stepped onto his porch with a rifle. The school teacher gathered her students safely inside, but positioned herself at a window where she could see everything. "Witnesses," Morrison said with satisfaction. "Even if we don't survive, there'll be people who can testify about what really happened here." The first gunshot shattered the morning air as one of Donovan's men tried to silence Doc Henley in the bell tower. But the physician had barricaded himself well, and the bell continued its urgent call to justice. "Now," Sarah said, rising from cover with her rifle ready. They moved toward the church in 2 groups, Jed and Morrison approaching from the west, while Sarah and Michael circled toward the east entrance. The plan was simple: create enough confusion to reach the altar where her father's evidence lay hidden, retrieve the deed, and escape before Donovan could rally his full forces. But Marcus Donovan had other plans. Sarah Whitmore. His voice boomed across the churchyard as he emerged from the building's main entrance, flanked by 4 armed men. "I've been waiting 22 years for this moment." Sarah stepped into the open, her rifle trained on her cousin's chest. At 50 yards, she could see the family resemblance that had once made her trust him. The same dark hair, the same strong jaw that had characterized the Whitmore bloodline for generations. "Hello, Marcus," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the space between them. "You're looking well for a man who's spent 2 decades living on stolen money." Marcus smiled, the same charming expression that had fooled her father all those years ago. "Sarah, dear cousin, you always did have a flair for the dramatic. Just like your father. My father was a better man than you'll ever be. Your father was a fool who thought law and morality could stand against money and power. I proved him wrong then, and I'll prove you wrong now." The bronze bell continued tolling overhead as Doc Henley maintained his desperate warning to the territory. Each peal seemed to strengthen Sarah's resolve, connecting her to her father's memory and her family's legacy. "Tell me, Marcus," Sarah called, "do you sleep well at night, knowing you murdered your own uncle? Knowing you poisoned my mother when I was just a child?" Marcus's smile faltered slightly. "Family loyalty is a luxury I couldn't afford. The Whitmore fortune was being wasted on your father's idealistic crusades. I simply redirected it toward more practical purposes like genocide. Progress requires sacrifice, Sarah. The Cherokee were never going to assimilate properly. The settlers were too weak to develop the land efficiently. I created order from chaos, prosperity from waste. Jed was moving closer to the church's side entrance, using Sarah's confrontation with Marcus to mask his approach. But Sarah knew she couldn't rely on distraction much longer. Donovan's patience was wearing thin, and his men were beginning to shift positions for a better shot. The church bell tolled again, its bronze voice carrying across Montana territory with news that justice had finally come to Dry Hook. The original deed emerged from its hiding place beneath the church altar like a resurrection, its oiled cloth wrapping perfectly preserved after 22 years in the darkness. Sarah's hands trembled as she unwrapped her father's final gift, the legal document that would restore justice to Montana territory and vindicate thousands of displaced families. The paper was yellowed with age, but completely legible. Every word of Judge William Whitmore's careful handwriting still clear. The territorial seal was intact, the signatures were authentic, and the witness marks were properly notarized. This wasn't just evidence, it was proof absolute that the Covenant's entire empire had been built on fraud. "My God," Morrison breathed, reading over Sarah's shoulder in the dim light filtering through the church's stained glass windows. "This deed transfers ownership of everything. Mining rights, railroad easements, water rights, grazing lands. We're talking about half of Montana territory. Outside, the battle was intensifying. Jed's cavalry saber had tasted blood again as he fought his way past Donovan's guards, each stroke of the blade carrying 20 years of suppressed rage. The weapon moved with deadly grace, cutting down men who'd spent 2 decades profiting from corruption and murder. But it was Sarah who faced the greatest danger. Marcus Donovan stood between her and the church's exit, his expensive pistol trained on her heart with the steady hand of a man who'd killed many times before. "The deed, Sarah," Marcus said calmly. "Hand it over, and I might let your friends live." "We both know you're lying," Sarah replied, clutching the precious document to her chest. "You can't afford to leave witnesses, not after everything that's happened." Marcus's smile was cold as winter stone. "You're right, of course. But I thought I'd offer you the chance to die with some dignity." For family's sake, the bronze church bell continued tolling above them, its urgent voice carrying news of the confrontation to every corner of the territory. Doc Henley's desperate warning had worked. Riders were already racing toward neighboring towns with word that the Covenant's crimes were finally being exposed. Emma's Cherokee warriors had created chaos throughout Dry Hook, attacking Covenant positions with the fury of people who'd lost everything to these men. Michael Standing Bear led a group of displaced Cherokee families in liberating the land office, where they were destroying fraudulent records and recovering stolen tribal documents. Sheriff Morrison had rallied the honest citizens of Dry Hook to stand against the Covenant's authority. The blacksmith, the general store owner, the school teacher, and a dozen others had taken positions throughout the town, their weapons trained on Marcus's remaining men, but the real victory would be decided here, in the church where Judge William Whitmore had died, trying to preserve the evidence that could save thousands of lives. "You know what this deed means, don't you?" Sarah asked, holding the document where Marcus could see it clearly. "Every land transaction you've made for 20 years becomes invalid. Every mining claim, every railroad deal, every displacement of Cherokee families, all of it built on property that was never yours to sell." Marcus's face darkened with rage. "My property. I'm the surviving male heir of the Whitmore family. Everything should have been mine from the beginning. After you murdered everyone else who had a claim to it. Family business, cousin. Nothing personal." Jed appeared in the church's side entrance, his cavalry saber dripping blood and his face grim with purpose. He'd fought his way through Marcus's guards, leaving a trail of bodies in his wake. The weapon that had defended the Union at Gettysburg had proven equally effective at defending justice in Montana territory. "Sarah," Jed called. "The way is clear. Let's go." But Marcus raised his pistol higher, his finger tightening on the trigger. "One more step and she dies." The deed dies with her. The original deed seemed to pulse with power in Sarah's hands as she made her final choice. For 20 years, she'd been a victim of Marcus's crimes. For 20 years, she'd carried the burden of her father's unfinished work. Now finally, she held the weapon that could destroy the Covenant forever. "You're wrong about one thing, Marcus," she said, backing slowly toward the altar where a shaft of sunlight fell through the stained glass windows. "This deed doesn't die with me. I've already made copies. Emma has one. Michael has another. Morrison has a third." Marcus's eyes widened as he realized the implications. "You're lying. Cherokee communities throughout 3 territories have copies. So do honest lawmen in a dozen towns. So do federal officials in Denver and Washington." Sarah's voice carried the ring of absolute truth. "Kill me, and you'll only make yourself the target of a manhunt that will span the entire continent." The deed caught the colored light from the windows as Sarah held it high, its words clearly visible to the townspeople gathering outside. The proof of 20 years of crime was finally being exposed to the light of day. Marcus Donovan's empire of corruption was crumbling around him, and the bronze church bell tolled his defeat with every resounding peal. 6 months after the gunshots fell silent in Dryhook's church, Sarah stood in the Denver federal courthouse wearing a simple blue dress and her father's gold watch chain, testifying before a panel of judges who would determine the fate of Montana Territory's largest criminal conspiracy in history. The wedding ring on her finger caught the afternoon light as she spoke, a band crafted by Jed from the gold of her father's pocket watch, melted down and reformed into a symbol of new beginnings built from old treasures. The metal carried the weight of family history and the promise of a future finally free from the shadows of the past. The Covenant operated with impunity for over 20 years, Sarah testified, her voice clear and strong in the hushed courtroom. They displaced hundreds of families, murdered dozens of witnesses, and stole millions of acres of land through systematic fraud and intimidation. In the gallery behind her sat the faces of Justice Restored, Emma Clearwater, now appointed as territorial liaison for displaced families, Joseph and Michael Standing Bear, representing Cherokee communities whose lands were being returned, Sheriff Morrison, whose courage had earned him appointment as regional marshal, and Doc Henley, whose heroic warning bell had saved countless lives. The federal investigation had moved with surprising speed once the evidence became public. Marcus Donovan's arrest had triggered a cascade of confessions from Covenant associates, each eager to reduce their sentences by revealing the full scope of the conspiracy. The network of corruption had reached into territorial governments across the West, but its exposure had led to the largest federal land rights restoration in American history. Mrs. Thorne, the lead judge, said, addressing Sarah by her married name, "Your testimony has been instrumental in identifying nearly 400 families wrongfully displaced from their properties. Can you tell the court what steps are being taken to ensure such injustices don't happen again?" Sarah glanced back at Jed, who sat in the front row with the quiet dignity of a man who'd found his purpose again. The mountain tracker who'd spent 20 years in self-imposed exile had become a territorial land inspector, using his knowledge of the wilderness to verify legitimate claims and expose fraudulent ones. "Your Honor, we've established a new territorial land office with oversight from multiple federal agencies. Every claim will be verified through multiple sources, and any transfer of native treaty lands must be approved by tribal councils and federal representatives. Most importantly, we've created a network of advocates, people who understand both the law and the land, to ensure that families have protection against future fraud." The wedding ring seemed to grow warm as Sarah spoke, connecting her to the man who'd helped her transform from victim to victor. Their courtship had been conducted between testimony sessions and land surveys, two people rebuilding their lives while helping to rebuild an entire territory's sense of justice. "And what of your personal property, Mrs. Thorne?" "The Whitmore estate that was illegally seized by the Covenant. "The ranch has been restored to my family, but we're not keeping it," Sarah replied. "Jed and I have decided to deed the majority of the land to a trust that will provide homesteads for displaced families, both native and settler. The mineral rights will fund schools and medical facilities for communities throughout the territory." In the months following Marcus Donovan's defeat, Sarah had discovered that reclaiming her identity meant more than just recovering stolen property. It meant choosing what kind of legacy she wanted to build from the ashes of her family's tragedy. The trial concluded 3 days later with convictions for Marcus and 17 Covenant associates. Marcus himself received life imprisonment for multiple murders, including those of Judge William Whitmore and Sarah's mother. The Covenant's assets, estimated at over $2 million, were seized for redistribution to victims' families. But the real victory had happened not in Denver's courthouse, but in the mountain cabin where Sarah and Jed had chosen to make their home. The same cabin where she'd first found safety after 20 years of captivity had become the headquarters for their new life together. On their wedding day, Emma had performed a Cherokee blessing ceremony while Doc Henley provided the legal paperwork and Sheriff Morrison stood as witness. The wedding ring, crafted from her father's watch gold, had been blessed by both Christian and Cherokee traditions, symbolizing the unity that was slowly healing Montana Territory's divisions. "Do you ever regret it?" Jed asked one evening as they sat on their cabin porch, watching the sunset over the valley where Cherokee families were rebuilding their communities on restored tribal lands. "Regret what?" Sarah replied, her hand finding his in the gathering twilight. "The life you might have had if none of this had happened. If your father hadn't been murdered, if the Covenant had never existed." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, considering the question seriously. The woman who'd emerged from 20 years of captivity was different from the young woman who'd disappeared in the fire. Harder in some ways, but also more compassionate. More aware of suffering, but also more committed to preventing it. "I regret the years we lost," she said finally. "I regret my father's death and my mother's murder. I regret every family that suffered because of Marcus's greed. But I don't regret who we've become because of it." The wedding ring caught the last rays of sunlight as she turned to face him. "We're not the same people we were 20 years ago. Jed, we're better, stronger. We know what's worth fighting for and what's worth dying for." In the distance, the lights of Dry Hook twinkled like stars, a community reborn from the ashes of corruption. The church bell that had called them to justice now rang each evening at sunset, a reminder that truth, though delayed, would always find its way to light. Sarah Whitmore Thorne had finally come home, not to the place she'd left, but to the place she'd helped create through courage, love, and an unwavering belief that justice was worth any price.